Armed conflict has been with us since the dawn of civilization. Archaeologists have unearthed evidence of armies as far back as 10,000 BC. Military history has always existed on a grand scale, with legendary battles fought on land, sea, and air. From ancient daggers to modern medals of honor, in expert hands, these relics reveal the stories of those who are no longer here to speak for themselves. Join us as we unlock the secrets of Militaria. Today on Militaria, we look at artifacts once belonging to a renowned Canadian author, pieces of a uniform signifying the weight of an admiral's station, and medals and other memorabilia owned by a soldier during the First World War. Gary looks at a relic Luger and letters from Canadian author and veteran William R. Byrd.
I am not one that lends myself to the supernatural. However, there's an element of premonition in there in that we all have those times.
Jennifer looks at a pair of epaulettes once worn by Sir Provo Wallis.
Provo Wallis was literally born next to the Atlantic Ocean. This was his destiny. Even if his father hadn't chosen it, I think he would have been drawn to the ocean and to a military service anyhow.
A grandson with a strong military heritage shows Kevin his grandfather's medals and other memorabilia.
The stories that go with these artifacts are as valuable as the artifacts themselves in my mind. And so many forgotten stories.
My name's Nick Drain, and I work at the Army Museum, Halifax Citadel. I brought in 3 letters from Will R. Byrd, as well as a relic Luger that he took as a souvenir in the First World War.
Born in 1891 in East Mapleton, Nova Scotia, William Richard Byrd was a soldier whose personal experience with death and combat led him to become an award-winning novelist. Byrd's history with grief began as a young boy, with the death of his father. In his 20s, he again faced loss when the Great War claimed his youngest brother Stephen, whom he had intended to serve alongside. Initially, Byrd was rejected from the CEF due to poor dental health. Determined to join, he underwent surgery to correct the issues and, by 1916, was on active duty. His immersion in warfare inspired numerous published works and earned him multiple accolades. Today, Byrd is remembered as a valued Canadian voice of First World War literature.
Welcome to Militaria. Nick, can you tell us what you brought in today?
Yeah, for sure. So I have a few different letters and a souvenir from the First World War. They're all belonging to Will R. Byrd. So Will Byrd was a soldier in the First World War. He's from Amherst, Nova Scotia. With these 3 letters, they're from various points in his life. So the first one is from 1920, so just after he returns from the war. The second's from 1930 when he's writing his books about the war. And then the third one's more of a personal one from 1945.
So the pistol that we have here is a relic. It's obviously seen better days. As we can see, all the wooden parts are missing. They would have rotted in the water and muck of the trenches. And this is a German Luger. It's a 9mm pistol. As we can see here, it's all seized together. How did he manage to get the souvenirs that he did have back to Canada?
For the Luger, for the pistol, he got it from the First World War, but he didn't actually retrieve it until 1936. He left it with a French family and then later picked it up when he went back to France.
Will Byrd was a Nova Scotian writer, so he was writing on and off before the war, was farming during the war when he did enlist. He came back to Amherst to enlist, but ended up serving in the 42nd Canadian Infantry Battalion, which was out of Montreal. It was another battalion of the Royal Highlanders of Canada, the Black Watch, which is a very, very historic regiment, a lot of ties to very, very deep pockets of Montreal millionaires, so much so that the Department of National Defense has to rent the armory that they're in from the regiment because the regiment owns their armory. So very, very deep pockets, very wealthy, very, very influential families served in this regiment. And because of that, he had maybe different views of the war than other people's did. These letters are, in my opinion, quite interesting and intriguing because they're letters that Will Byrd wrote to his friend Edward McClellan, and at different points in his life. He's very opinionated about those that led the battalion, and he doesn't hold back in this letter to his friend. And then to the 1945 letter, it's another point in his life. He'd lost his son during the Second World War, who was with the North Nova Scotia Highlanders. He was killed in action. And it was his only son, who was named after his brother, who was killed in the First War. He gets back from the war, writes about his exploits during the war, and then he starts writing for Maclean's, and that's why he went back to France in 1931 to do a series on the war for Maclean's, and he continued to write books.
He really gets the best sense I've ever seen of anyone that's ever written about the First World War, of what it's actually like to experience it, how the war is having an effect on his mental health. It's his writing ability, I guess. So he was a writer before the war, and he continued to be a writer for the rest of his life.
What I find interesting as well is that when he republished And Ghosts Have Warm Hands, which is an obvious reference to his brother and how his brother guided him through the war and kept him safe.
He sees his brother walk up to him with his rifle in full kit and then walk away, and he realizes from seeing that his brother has died, and he gets a telegram the next day saying he has died, so he goes home right away to sign up to fight in the war. And then throughout his whole experience of the war, he sees his brother. His brother keeps coming back to him and saving him from various instances of getting dragged away from trenches that get hit.
So Nick, can you give us some examples of when his brother came to Will in the trenches and how that saved his life?
One of the later times was when he was in reserve in the back lines out of the trenches. He went up to talk with one of the sentries at a post at the edge of the town, and he was just talking with him, and he felt the tap on his shoulder. And at this point, he knew that he had to get out of that area right away. So he just stopped his conversation with the sentry and just turned around and walked away, and a shell comes and hits the post and kills the sentry that he was just talking to.
At first, he probably didn't have a clue what was going on, but then realized that it was his brother, looking out for him and, trying to keep him safe. So Nick, thank you so much for bringing these artifacts in. Do you know what's going to be happening with the letters that we recently acquired?
Photographs have been taken of them, and you'll be able to view them. They're going to be in the collections at the Army Museum in Halifax Citadel. One of the best places to get an actual idea of the experience of the First World War is with Will Byrd.
I found it very intriguing how a young historian like Nick could just read a couple of letters about someone he's never heard of, go out and buy one of his books to learn more about the man and be taken with his writing and how he saw the First World War. The impact they had on Nick, I found was very interesting.
Coming up on Militaria.
There was so much involved in representing the British Navy, and the epaulettes were just an indication of the weight that you had to carry. My name is Lisa McNiven, and I'm an archivist at the Naval Museum of Halifax. I've brought in a pair of epaulettes from Sir Provo Wallis.
Born on April 12, 1791, Sir Provo William Parry Wallis was, from birth, groomed for a life on the sea. His father registered him as a seaman at only 4 years old, and by age 17 earned Wallis enough on-paper experience to make lieutenant. From there, it didn't take long for him to define his career. On June 1, 1813, just under a year into the War of 1812, Wallis sailed into the Boston Harbor aboard the HMS Shannon, serving under the command of Captain Philip Broke. The men were looking for a fight. The USS Chesapeake answered the call and surrendered in under 15 minutes. Captain Broke sustained debilitating wounds during the battle, leaving Wallis to successfully captain both ships back to Halifax, and a legacy was born.
Hi, Lisa. Welcome back to Militaria. What have you brought us today?
I have brought a beautiful set of epaulettes from Sir William Provo Wallis, famous for the War of 1812 and the Shannon and the Chesapeake. Today's artifact, Provost Wallace's Epaulettes, is a small reminder of a very intricate uniform that you would have had to wear as a British officer. And there was so much involved in representing the British Navy. And the epaulettes are just an indication of the weight that you had to carry. It was very complex and very detailed.
What is the difference between a pair of epaulettes and a shoulder board?
Well, today's Canadian Navy has shoulder boards, and you can tell by the rank by the number of vertical indications on the shoulder board. But the British Navy obviously had a more elaborate scheme of representation, and they would have had a ceremonial and also a working option for shoulder boards.
These epaulettes are a wonderful example of epaulettes of the time. Here you have a beautiful naval button with the anchor and crown on it. This star represents a lieutenant commander. And then this, of course, represents that it is a Naval Royal Navy set of epaulettes. It is a beautiful artifact also because these would have been handmade. This gold wire you see here is hand spun, and it is gold wire. And then you have gold thread, and you have silk that lines around the centerpiece of it. So these are a very fancy pair of epaulettes, and they would have been worn with a formal uniform.
And they're quite heavy.
Yes, they're extremely heavy, being made from wired gold. Would have been quite a weight to carry on your shoulder. These would have been very expensive to purchase at the time. And so when you make an elaborate, expensive purchase, you want to take care of it. So here is a traveling case for these pair of epaulettes. As you open it up, as you see, it's just a standard basic thing lined with copper. And they would sit facing each other, so the upper parts would be here and here. These kind of cases were typical of the time for not only epaulettes, but for tricorn hats and other naval gear. It kept it in good condition. If you took your kit to sea, it kept it safe from any elements or anything that could have happened to it. The fact that these epaulettes have the original traveling case is very significant and very fortunate. Provost Wallace, he was actually born in the Halifax dockyard in 1791 to an ordinary clerk, Featherstone Wallace. His dad actually was a very successful clerk. He wielded a bit of power in the dockyard. And so when his son was born, he immediately called in a few of those favors and had his son enlisted in the Royal Navy at the young age of 4. Now, mind you, at the age of 4, he would not be actively serving on a ship and would have been thrown into it right away. He was sent to England for education and then got his training and started to serve on ship when he was just a young boy, and then started to work his way up through the Royal Navy.
So his father obviously had a destiny planned for him in the Royal Navy. This was the grand plan.
Absolutely. To this day, Sir Provost Wallace is the longest serving member of the Royal Navy. He served for around 96, 97 years. Yeah, he died just shy of his 100th birthday.
And I've heard him being represented as the father of the British Royal Navy.
Absolutely. He had joined the Royal Navy at a time when he wasn't forced to retire. Sir Provost Wallace serving such a lengthy naval career, we're talking like 96 years. I mean, that's something that's not very common, definitely not today. People do retire usually a little sooner than that. In Provost Wallace's case, by the time it came up that people would retire from naval service, I guess he just made the personal choice that that was not for him and that he continued to serve, either being a sense of duty or the fact that he actually really enjoyed what he did. He was just one of those rare cases that kept on going. So what really put Provost Wallace on the map was his action during the War of 1812. When the War of 1812 broke out, he was serving as the first lieutenant on board HMS Shannon. The Shannon was in Halifax. Her orders there were to patrol the coastline. And so the Shannon was on patrol, headed down towards the harbor in front of Boston. And it was there that she encountered the USS Chesapeake. It was quite a lengthy engagement of firing cannonballs back and forth and taking a chunk out of each other. During that engagement, unfortunately, the Shannon lost a couple of their commanding officers. The captain himself, Brooke, was injured, ended up getting a piece of wooden shrapnel in his neck, which he actually survived. But because that happened, he wasn't able to command the ship and to continue the battle, so he turned it over to his last standing first lieutenant, which was Sir Provost Wallace. He was 21 years old at the time. In the middle of this battle, asked, take command, let's get this done. And so when the battle ended and the Shannon won and took the Chesapeake as a war prize and the crew as POWs, It was Provo Wallis who had the honor and the order to sail both ships with both crews back to Halifax Harbor. It was really that action on the Shannon that led Provo Wallis to being promoted to a lieutenant commander, which I guess in honor of achieving that rank, he bought these beautiful epaulettes to go with his new uniform, his new rank. He would have been very proud. I mean, at the age of 21, 22, it's quite an achievement to have.
Absolutely, a source of pride and honor. Beautiful.
At the museum, what do we actively do to help preserve these beautiful epaulettes? Because as I can see, they're made from multiple materials, everything from silk to gold wire. Is there any special care that's involved in taking care of these?
Well, we're very lucky that they're in such great condition. If we needed to do repairs or address a concern, we would definitely have to hire a conservator that had a specialty in metalworks and fabric.
Lisa, thank you so much for sharing these wonderful epaulettes with us and the story of Sir Provo Wallis.
Wonderful story to share. You're welcome.
Coming up on Militaria.
A lot of these fellows were pipe enthusiasts. So again, these are classic pieces of First World War trench art.
My name's Andrew King, and I brought in some items that were my mother's father, my grandfather, Walter John Hartley's. And I brought in his wartime medals and some artifacts that he had collected on some of his postings, and his soldier's record book.
Throughout the history of conflict, armies have relied on a variety of administration tracking systems to account for their servicemen and women. During World War I, service records followed Canadian Expeditionary Force members in and out of their theatre of engagement. With the corresponding dates and source of information, the documents covered everything from training and promotions to medal entitlements and notifications of discharge or death. The resulting service files may contain up to 200 pages, depending on the duration of one's service. For surviving family members, these records paint a detailed picture of a loved one's experience in war, and many are now accessible online today.
Well, I'd like to welcome Andrew King to Militaria.
Thank you, Kevin. I'm really proud to be here. Here in the center are medals that were my grandfather's, and close to you there is an incense burner. He would collect things on some of his postings. And here is a piece of trench art that is made out of 2 German shell casings. And there's insignia on the front when it was found during the First World War.
Yes. This is, again, as you were saying, it's a shell casing from a German short field piece. This has been converted in a workshop either by Canadian veterans or Belgian workers and artisans into a pipe tobacco canister or humidor. This actually is very interesting too, is that it has an 85th Battalion Nova Scotia Highlanders collar dog on it.
Nice, cool.
And as we know, inside this little shell casing are pipe tools. We have inside this shell casing, converted, made inert, there's a pipe tamper, the scraper for cleaning the bowl. And again, if you want to give it a really good clean, you can use the scoop. A lot of these fellows were pipe enthusiasts. So again, these are classic pieces of First World War trench art. Andrew, I was wondering if you could tell us where your grandfather acquired this incense burner.
Well, when my mother was about 2 years old, they were stationed in Hong Kong. And so he collected a large amount of brass, teak, items, and it's now been in our family.
For almost 100 years by now.
Almost 100 years, yes.
So again, this is a beautiful bronze or brass incense burner. It has a Pekingese dog on top. And again, comes in, well, 1, 2, 3 pieces. So it would have been fairly easy to bring back home in a pack or a duffel bag. Now, you were saying with that, your family came to Canada, your grandparents, to be close to their daughter.
Yes.
It's a very touching story in that they come to Canada after the war to be with their only girl and her North Novi husband. So I think it's a really quite a wonderful story. And again, it shows how tight they were. You've got a lot of military sort of heritage on both sides of the ocean.
I do.
Yeah.
My grandfather instructed my mom, he said, no, you're not to bring home a colonialist
Yeah.
or an American.
Yeah.
And my dad, very charismatic. He went and met him, and he says, I'm taking your daughter back to Canada.
Oh, my goodness.
But they got along great because
I bet.
infantrymen.
Yeah, they're both soldiers, yeah. Now, again, your grandfather, as you and your older brother are quite aware, is a survivor of the opening phase of the First World War with the British Expeditionary Force that arrives in France in August 1914. You don't often meet someone whose, grandfather or great uncle actually survived being an old contemptible. It is rare to see someone like that on this side of the Atlantic. There's some 70,000 British troops that arrive in France with the BEF at that time. These are professional soldiers. This is, the bulk of the British Army in that time period. And again, you have here your grandfather having survived that time period. You have a 1914 star, which is awarded at the end of the war to those troops of the Commonwealth services, but in this case, for predominantly the British Army, to survivors that survived that time period. This is an exceptionally rare thing to see in Canada because there are very few Canadians overseas serving at that time.
Okay.
Might be the odd young officer that's made his way into the British Army prior to that, but this is very much like a British Army award. And again, one awarded to those troops that arrived in 14 and who survived to Christmas 1914. So we have your grandfather's 1914 star. We have the War Medal, the Victory Medal. Here again, awards given to him following the First World War service, his Long Service Medal, and his Good Conduct Medal. Now, Andrew, we're looking at your grandfather's pay book, some of his orders, his Army records. It would appear that he was gassed in 1915 with chlorine gas, and then will spend much of the remainder of the war with the Royal Army Medical Corps in Egypt.
Yes.
So your grandfather, like many people, would suffer, from what I understand, complications from being gassed. I was wondering if you could tell us how that affected him in later life after the war.
He suffered a lot of bronchitis,
Yeah.
a lot of breathing difficulties. Back then, today would probably be called COPD.
Yes. Yeah, I would be. Yeah.
And eventually, when he was 61 years old, it took his life.
An enormously interesting life, one of service, and again, a life brought to a much too early end. Well, Andrew, I'd like to thank you so much for bringing this in and sharing your family's story. Gas and the war still claiming people 40 years afterwards and still taking people's lives. Yeah.
Thank you. I really appreciate coming in here today. It's been a great opportunity for me, learning. We all should be taking the opportunity, if we have these artifacts, to maintain them and not just hide them away, but show them to people. And I think it's very important to keep them in families. But the stories that go with these artifacts are as valuable as the artifacts themselves, in my mind. And so many forgotten stories, that we may never hear about. And so I'm very fortunate and blessed to have this lineage left to me to, pass down along.